The Book of Gramarye. They were in a bright room again, a room unlike anything Will had ever seen. The ceilings were high, painted with pictures of trees and woods and mountains. The walls were paneled in shiny gold wood, lit here and there by strange, glowing white globes. And the room was full of music, their own carol taken up by many voices, and a gathering of people dressed like a brilliant scene from a history book. The women, bare-shouldered, wore long, full dresses with elaborately looped and ruffled skirts. The men wore suits not unlike Merriman's, with squared-off tailcoats, long straight trousers, white ruffles, or black silk cravats at the neck. Indeed, now that Will came to look again at Merriman, he realized that the clothes he wore had never really been those of a butler at all, but belonged totally to this other century, whichever it might be. A lady in a white dress was sweeping forward to meet them, people round her moving respectfully back to make way, and as the carol ended she cried, "Beautiful, beautiful, come in, come in." The voice was exactly the voice of Miss Greythorne greeting them at the manor door a little while earlier, and when Will looked up at the face, he saw that in a sense this was Miss Greythorne too. There were the same eyes and rather bony face, the same friendly but imperious manner, only this Miss Greythorne was much younger and prettier, like a flower that had unfolded from the bud, but not yet been battered by the sun and wind and days. "Come, Will," she said, and took his hand, smiling down at him, and he went easily to her. It was so clear that she knew him, and that those around her, men, women, young and old, all smiling and gay, knew him too. Most of the bright crowd was leaving the room now, couples and chattering groups, in the direction of a delicious cooking smell that clearly signaled supper somewhere else in the house. But a group of a score or so remained. "We were waiting for you," said Miss Greythorne, and drew him toward the back of the room, where a fire blazed, warm and friendly, in an ornate fireplace. She was looking at Merriman, too, including him in the words. "We are all ready. There are no hindrances." "Are you sure?" Merriman's voice came quick and deep, like a hammer stroke, and Will glanced up curiously, but the hawk-nosed face was as secret as ever. "Quite sure," said the lady. Suddenly she knelt down beside Will, her skirt billowing round her like a great white rose. She was at his eye level now, and she held both his hands, gazing at him, and spoke softly and urgently. "It is the third sign, Will, the sign of wood. We call it the sign of learning. This is the time for remaking the sign. In every century since the beginning, Will, every 100 years the sign of wood must be renewed, for it is the only one of the 6 that cannot keep its nature unchanged. Every 100 years we have remade it, in the way that we were first taught, and now this will be the last time, because when your own century comes, you will take it out for all time, for the joining, and there need be no more renewing then." She stood up and said clearly, "We are glad to see you. Will Stanton, sign seeker, very, very glad." Then there was a general rumble of voices, low and high, soft and deep, all approving and agreeing. It was like a wall, Will thought. You could lean against it and feel support. Very strongly he could feel the strength of friendship that came out of this small group of unfamiliar, handsomely dressed people. He wondered whether all of them were old ones. Looking up at Merriman beside him, he grinned in delight, and Merriman smiled down at him with a look of more open, relaxed pleasure than Will had yet seen on the stern, rather grim face. "It is almost time," Miss Greythorne said. "Some small refreshment for the newcomers first, perhaps," a man beside them said, a small man, not much taller than Will. He held out a glass. Will took it, glancing up, and found himself staring into a thin, lively face, almost triangular, thickly lined, yet not yet old, with a pair of startlingly bright eyes staring at and somehow into him. It was a disturbing face, with much behind it. But the man had swung away from him, presenting Will only with a neat green velvet-covered back, and was handing a glass to Merriman. "My lord," he said, deferentially as he did so, and bowed. Merriman looked at him with a comical twist of mouth, said nothing, but stared mockingly and waited. Before Will had a chance even to begin puzzling over the greeting, the small man blinked and seemed suddenly to collect his wits, like a dreamer abruptly woken. He burst out laughing. "Oh, no," he said, sputtering. "Stop it. I have had the habit for long years, after all. Merriman chuckled affectionately, raised the glass to him, and drank. And since he could make no sense of this odd exchange, Will drank too, and was filled with astonishment by an unrecognizable taste that was less a taste than a blaze of light, a burst of music, something fierce and wonderful sweeping over all his senses at once. "What is it?" The small man swung around and laughed, his creased face slanting all its lines upward. "Methelgon used to be its nearest name," he said, taking the empty glass. He blew into it, said unexpectedly, "An old one's eyes can see," and held it out. And staring into the clear base, Will suddenly felt he could see a group of figures in brown robes making whatever it was he had just drunk. He glanced up to see the man in the green coat watching him closely with a disturbing expression that was like a mixture of envy and satisfaction. Then the man chuckled and whisked the glass away, and Miss Greythorne was calling for them to come to her. The white globes of light in the room grew dim and the voices quiet. Somewhere in the house, Will thought he could still hear music, but he was not sure. Miss Greythorne stood by the fire. For a moment she looked down at Will, then up at Merriman. Then she turned away from them and looked at the wall. She stared and stared for a long time. The paneling in the fireplace and the overmantel were all one, all carved from the same golden wood, very plain, with no curves or flourishes, but only a simple four-petaled rose set in a square here and there. She put up her hand to one of these small rose carvings on the top left-hand corner of the fireplace, and she pressed its center. There was a click, and below the rose, at the level of her waist, a square dark hole in the paneling appeared. Will did not see any panels slide away. The hole was simply suddenly there, and Miss Greythorne put in her hand and drew out an object shaped like a small circle. It was the image of two that he himself. It was the image of the two that he had himself, and he found that his hand, as once before, had already moved of its own accord and was clasping them protectively. There was total silence in the room from outside the doors. Will could certainly hear music now, but could not make out the nature of it. The sign circle was very thin and dark, and one of its inside cross arms broke as he watched. Miss Greythorne held it out to Merriman, and a little more fell away into dust. Will could see now that it was wood, roughened and worn, but with a grain running through. "That's 100 years old," he said. "Every 100 years the renewing," she said. "Yes," Will said impulsively into the silent room. But would it last much longer than that? I've seen some in the British Museum, bits of old boats they dug up by the Thames, prehistoric, thousands of years old." "Quercus Britannicus," Merriman said severely and abruptly, sounding like a cross professor. "Oak. The canoes you refer to were made of oak, and further south the oaken piles on which the present Cathedral of Winchester stands were sunk some 900 years ago, and are as tough today as they were then. Oh yes, oak lasts a very long time, Will Stanton, and there will come a day when the root of an oak tree will play a very important part in your young life. But oak is not the wood for the sign. Our wood is one which the dark does not love. Rowan. Will, that's our tree. Mountain ash. There are qualities in rowan, as in no other wood on the earth, that we need. But also there are strains on the sign that rowan cannot survive as oak might, or as iron and bronze do, so the sign must be reborn." He held it up between one long finger and a deeply back-curved thumb. Every 100 years. Will nodded. He said nothing. He found himself very conscious of the people in the room. It was as if they were all concentrating very hard on one thing, and you could hear the concentration, and they seemed suddenly multiplied, endless, a vast crowd stretching out beyond the house and beyond this century or any other. He did not fully understand what happened next. Merriman jerked his hand forward suddenly, broke the wooden sign easily in half, and tossed it in the fire, where the great single log, like their own Yule log, was halfway burned down. The flames leapt. Then Miss Greythorne reached out toward the small man in the green velvet coat, took from him the silver jug from which he had poured drinks, and threw the contents of the jug on the fire. There was a great hissing and smoking, and the fire was dead, and she leaned forward in her long white dress, and put her arm into the smoke and the smoldering ashes, and brought out a part-burned piece of the big log. It was like a large, irregular disk. Holding the lump of wood high so that everyone could see, she began to take the blackened pieces from it as though she were peeling an orange. Her fingers moved quickly, and the burned edges fell away, and the skeleton of the wooden piece was left, a clear, smooth circle containing a cross. There was no irregularity to it at all, as though it had never before had any other shape than this, and on Miss Greythorne's white hands there was not even a trace of soot or ash. "Will Stanton," she said, turning to him, "here is your third sign. I may not give it to you in this century. Your quests must all along be fulfilled within your own time, but the wood is the sign of learning, and when you have done with your own particular learning, you will find it, and I can leave in your mind the movements that the finding will take." She looked hard at Will, and then reached up and slipped the strange wooden circle into the dark hole in the paneling with her other hand. She pressed the carved rose in the wall above it, and with the same sight-deafening flash as before, the hole was suddenly no longer there. The wood-paneled wall was smooth and unbroken, as if there had been no change at all. Will stared. Remember how it was done. Remember, she had pressed the first carved rose on the top left-hand corner. But now there were 3 roses in a group at that corner. Which one should it be? As he looked more closely, he saw in fearful astonishment that now the whole wall paneling was covered in squares of carved wood, each containing a single 4-petaled rose. Had they grown at this moment beneath his eyes, or had they been there all along, invisible because of a trick of the light? He shook his head in alarm, and looked round for Merriman, but it was too late. Nobody was close by him. Solemnity had left the air, the lights were bright again, and everybody was cheerful, talking. Merriman was murmuring something to Miss Greythorne, bending almost double to speak close to her ear. Will felt a touch on his arm and swung round. It was the small man in the green coat, beckoning to him. Near the doors at the other end of the room, the group of musicians who had accompanied the carol began playing again, a gentle sound of recorders and violins, and what he thought was a harpsichord. It was another carol they were playing now, an old one, much older than the century of the room. Will wanted to listen, but the man in green had hold of his arm and was drawing him insistently toward a side door.